Module 4. In this module we'll be talking about different qualitative approaches to conducting communication research. And we've talked about data in the past couple of modules, and essentially qualitative data means that we're looking at words or symbols that our participants might use, whereas quantitative data, which we'll talk about in the next and last module, would be more numeric data, or we might convert words into numeric form so that we can statistically analyze them. But for now we're talking about qualitative data, which, as I said, would be the words or symbols that participants might use. There are several different qualitative approaches that we'll be talking about in this module. And the first one in Chapter 10 is ethnography. And ethnography basically is the study of people's methods. And there are different approaches to conducting ethnography that you'll read about in Chapter 10. One is the speaking framework that was formulated by Del Hymes. And this is an acronym, and so you'll read about what each of the letters stand for. For example, S stands for the scene. So Jerry Phillipson is someone who used this framework when he studied miners back in, or excuse me, auto workers back in Pennsylvania. And so what he looked at was, what did it mean to be a man? How did you express your masculinity in that environment? And he used the speaking framework for that. A second approach is ethnography of communication, and ethnography of communication takes a more cultural approach, so it looks at what are the specific cultural phenomena associated with a particular group of people. Autoethnography is something that is, as the name implies, is the researcher looking at his or her own experience. So I can think of an example of a woman I know who actually lived in a shelter for abused women, and while she was there she conducted an autoethnography, basically reflecting on her own experience in that environment. There are a lot of different considerations when working in the field, whether or not to disclose who you are as a researcher, how to take notes, how involved to become in the particular situation, and so you read about all of these considerations in Chapter 10. A second approach, or second qualitative method that you'll read about in Chapter 11 is interviewing, and there are different approaches to interviewing, and they basically rest on how structured the interview is. So they could be very structured, say for example where you have all the questions and you don't deviate from those questions when you're interacting with your participants, to a very unstructured approach where you just sort of have ideas of something that you want to talk about. And I can think of an example of a friend of mine conducted research doing interviews looking at the narratives of Holocaust survivors. And so basically she just started these interviews by asking them to talk about their story, what was their experience during the Holocaust, and they began to speak and tell their story. So it was a very unstructured approach. The other thing you'll read about in Chapter 11 are how to plan for interviews. So how are you going to record the interviews? How are you going to get your participants? What arrangements will you have in terms of meeting the participants? Those sorts of things that you'll read about in Chapter 11. Another approach to conducting qualitative research would be focus groups. And the difference here between an interview, which would be face-to-face, one-on-one with an individual, focus groups obviously involve many different people, usually about 7 to 10 people who have the same experience. So the benefit is that you can gather these different perspectives or experiences at one time, rather than doing interviews where you're meeting with one person individually. The other benefit is that oftentimes if you have members of the focus group who hear another person's story, it can help them remember experiences that they might not have remembered in a one-on-one interview. The other thing you'll read about in Chapter 12 is how to prepare for and conduct focus groups. And one of the things you have to remember in conducting a focus group is that sometimes one participant or two can monopolize the conversation, so you have to have a really skilled moderator to help prevent one or two people from monopolizing the conversation. Then moving on, chapter 3, you'll talk about how to actually analyze the data. And so oftentimes if we're doing interviews or focus groups, those will be recorded and then those recordings will be transcribed. And so it's taking that raw data, those words or symbols that we talked about as qualitative data, and then analyzing them. And the basic approach that's very common in social scientific research, in communication in particular, is a grounded theory approach. And you'll read about two different approaches to grounded theory, the Straussian approach and the Glaserian approach. And basically, the grounded theory approach looks at finding commonalities across the data. So what themes emerge from the participants that you spoke to. So in Jerry Phillipson's case, when he was interviewing and meeting with people who worked in, men who worked in Pennsylvania, what were the common themes that he found when he was interviewing and conducting his observations. So you'll read about those two different grounded theory approaches. There are, of course, alternatives to analyzing qualitative data, and this could be thematic analysis or content analysis, and we'll discuss content analysis in chapter 14. Now, content analysis in our discipline is primarily used as a quantitative approach, and for those of you in the mass media concentration, it's a very common approach to study television or movies, and it's a quantitative approach, but it can also be used as a more qualitative approach as well. Then the last part of this module, Module 4, is Chapter 19 and 20, and Chapter 19 takes a look at rhetorical criticism, and rhetoric is really the foundation of the communication discipline. It's how we began, and if you're conducting a rhetorical criticism, the techniques that you would use would be one to first select an artifact, and this could be anything. It could be a speech. Rhetorical criticism in our field really began by looking at presidential rhetoric, and so the artifacts would be presidential speeches or debates, but it can also be things like pieces of art, it could be buildings, it could be national monuments, just about anything you can think of that's created by people could be an artifact that a rhetorician could take a look at and examine. And there are different theories, Neo-Aristotelian, metaphor, fantasy theme. Kenneth Burke has many theories that are used to examine rhetoric in our discipline, rhetorical artifacts. So this is a very foundational aspect of the communication discipline. And then the last chapter in this module, chapter 20, is the process of critique, and the difference here between rhetorical criticism and critique is that with rhetorical criticism we're looking at, examining this particular artifact from that theoretical perspective, but from the critique perspective what we're doing is actually judging that artifact, and so that judgment could be, very basically, is the artifact good or bad based on whatever theoretical perspective you're taking. And some of the theories you're probably familiar with are Marxism, postmodernism, feminism, queer theory. So it would be looking at those artifacts, it could be the same thing, TV shows, movies, presidential speeches, and examining them from these different theoretical perspectives. So some of the things to keep in mind to complete for Module 4, one, obviously read chapters 10, 11, 12, 13, 19, and 20. Watch the related video material for each chapter that you'll find on Blackboard. Answer one of the 3 discussion questions that you'll find in the discussion forum area. Complete quizzes 5, 6, and 7, and then last would be to submit portions A and B of the research proposal. So I want to talk a little bit more about that. So as you notice in the syllabus, you're building on this paper through the term. So the first thing you need to do is revise portion A based on the feedback that I gave you. Then you'll be adding portion B to your revised portion A to create one complete paper. So you're not submitting 2 different papers, it's just adding portion B to your already created portion A. And portion B is the literature review for your complete paper. And so take a look at the syllabus, but some things that you might want to include in your lit review would be literature that looks at your theory, literature that looks at the variables or concepts in your research question or hypothesis, past research in the general area of, or the general topic of your research paper. One of the very important things to think about is how you're organizing your literature reviews. So it's not a good idea to take a particular article and then summarize that article in a paragraph and then move on to another paper or book and summarize that, and just summarizing article after article in individual paragraphs. Rather, I want to see that you can organize the literature based on themes that you see in the literature that you've examined. And if you use section headings within the literature review, that helps to show me how you're organizing that literature. And then, of course, use high-quality scholarly sources. So I've given you some tips in the syllabus for places to look for sources, whether that's using EBSCOhost or PsycInfo or some of the other databases that you have available through the library website. Then the last thing that or just a reminder that this portion is 6 to 8 pages added to portion A. So this portion B is, like I say, 6 to 8 pages, and again, that does not include the title page and reference page. Of course, if you have questions about completing the paper or anything else in this module, post them to the discussion board, the class questions discussion board on Blackboard, or you can email me directly with your question.